I was touring with the Womack brothers, Bobby Womack, and Mavis Staple, the Dixie Hummingbirds, Swan Silvertones. Me and Marvin used to pack records for Atla Records.
Why was David Ruffin fired from the Temptations?
You know, and when you are a group, you have to move and think as one unit. You cannot have five guys going, five different directions.
Not everyone born with a God-given voice gets to live like a star. Some talents rise from the mud, only to be drowned by the very spotlight they chase. And David Ruffin is the cruelest example of that. Once the soulful voice of the Temptations, he left millions spellbound with high notes dripping with emotion. But few know that behind the curtain, his life was a relentless string of tragedies. He lived in million-dollar mansions, yet died alone, collapsing on a sidewalk like a nobody. What happened? How did a legend fall so far? Are you ready to open the door to the truth? Brace yourself, because what happened to David Ruffin is harsher than you could ever imagine. On the afternoon of January 18, 1941, in Wynot, a tiny dirt-poor town in Mississippi, David Ruffin let out his first cry amid a bone-chilling wind that cut like a knife. The rickety wooden house, nestled in a field of scorched cotton, was the only shelter for his struggling family. Wind slipped through every crack in the walls, carrying the bitter cold of a brutal life. In the cramped room, his mother lay exhausted after labor, while his father, Elias, stood silent as a shadow, betraying no emotion. Outside was a cold, unforgiving world, but inside this house, silent storms were already brewing. David's childhood passed in hunger and violence. The house barely had room for 5 people to squeeze in, and sleep was often broken by the howling wind or Elias's drunken footsteps stumbling home at night. Working long days in the fields didn't earn enough to feed the family, but most of the meager earnings went to whiskey. David's mother, Ophelia, grew weaker, trying to hold together scraps of clothing for her kids. But she collapsed in 1945, leaving 4 children lost in the cruelty of their father and the world beyond. From then on, life became an endless stretch of endurance. Elias was no longer a father, but a jailer, quick to punish with a leather strap for the smallest mistakes. The beatings left David's back scarred, but worse was the silence he forced himself to keep because he knew crying only made the blows harder. Once, just for dropping his mother's ceramic jar, he was whipped until his back bled. That memory never faded. The scars remained, and every touch brought his childhood screaming back in nightmares. Wynot wasn't just poor, it was an invisible trap strangling any hope of a future. As black folks, the Ruffins lived under the scornful glares of white townspeople. Even before he fully understood the world, David was out in the fields with his siblings, working under a sun that burned the skin. His young hands swelled and bled from cotton thorns, but stopping wasn't an option. Not with Elias's watchful eyes and the whip ready to swing. School was a distant dream. The path to the classroom was too long, and the work was too much. Sometimes, on that dusty red road, white kids would block his way, throwing rocks and slurs. Once, a sharp stone sliced his forehead, leaving him dazed as blood streamed down his face. But he got up, no tears, no backing down. In that moment, amid their mocking laughter, David silently vowed he wouldn't be buried in this place. Not because he was strong enough, but because at the end of endurance, the dream of escaping Wynot was the only thing keeping him alive. In those dark days, a faint glimmer of hope shone through the local Baptist church. Every Sunday morning, David stood in the choir, his clear, powerful voice rising like a breeze, tearing through the gloom in the souls of those who listened. His singing hushed the congregation as if something sacred had appeared within those weathered wooden walls. Ms. Cora, the church's music director, watched him with quiet faith, as if she could see a future beyond Wynot's barren fields. But to David, that faith felt out of reach. Each time he sang, he wasn't just performing, he was pouring out every suppressed longing, a silent rebellion, and a desperate cry into the void. In 1952, his life took a new turn. During a routine Sunday service, a stranger from Memphis showed up. After hearing David perform, he approached the family and offered to take the boy to a gospel show in a nearby town for a small fee. Elias agreed, not because he saw his son's potential, but because the money could buy dinner that night. Days later, David stepped onto a stage, small, cramped with flickering lights, but he sang with all the pain bottled up inside. Every word cut into the hearts of the audience. When the applause erupted, he felt something new, the sensation of being seen, heard, valued. But back home, that dream was quickly crushed. The earnings were snatched from his hands, and insults rained down, as if to declare he'd never amount to anything under that roof. That humiliation became a lingering wound, following him through the days ahead. From Elias's beatings, the contemptuous looks on the street, to the scratches on his hands after each day's labor, it all carved a nameless rage into David. By 1954, when he was just 13, a final breaking point pushed him past endurance. After a fight over being forced to do his brother's chores, Elias unleashed his fury with the whip. This time, the blows were so brutal, David couldn't stand. That night, as the house fell quiet, he curled up in the dark and made a choice. He quietly took a few coins hidden under the bed, left a note for his sister, and slipped away into the night. With only a stale loaf of bread and a torn shirt, David hitched a ride on a freight truck leaving town. He didn't know exactly where he was headed, just that Memphis lay ahead, and maybe a way out. That escape wasn't just his first departure, it was his first step into a harsher world. Memphis, with its dazzling lights and gospel music, promised a different future, but it demanded more than he'd ever known. Hunger, cold, loneliness, and relentless mental trials came crashing in. But David didn't turn back. The scars on his back, his raw singing voice, and the emotional wounds of childhood became his baggage, both his strength and his burden, on the journey to becoming a man, carrying both light and darkness. On the morning of June 7, 1954, the sun beat down on Memphis's dusty streets. The truck stopped by the roadside, leaving David, skinny, clothes in tatters, eyes wide at the new world before him. The city was loud, unfamiliar, and utterly alien. In his pocket were a few coins and a fragile belief that his voice, if strong enough, could save him. But Memphis wasn't a dream. It was the start of a brutal journey where old wounds would only be cut deeper. And from that moment, David Ruffin was no longer a boy running away. He was a soul fighting to survive, in a strange city with a brittle dream and a past that wouldn't let go. The first days in Memphis were a drawn-out nightmare. Homeless, with no kin, David wandered through dark alleys, sleeping under bridges or curling up in hidden corners of train stations. Hunger gnawed at him, forcing him to dig through trash for moldy bread or scraps of spoiled meat. One stormy night, June 12, 1954, he huddled under a soggy piece of cardboard, shivering in drenched clothes, when a drunk tossed him a coin with a sneer. David clutched it, not for its value, but from the rage burning in his chest. He'd fled Wynot, believing in a new horizon. But Memphis, it turned out, was just as cold and cruel as home. In that despair, a quiet resolve took root. If he didn't want to be buried, he had to survive, no matter the cost. To get by, David took any job he could. He roamed Beale Street, shining shoes for sharply dressed men, earning a few cents for a meager meal. His thin hands trembled with each polish, but his eyes stayed fixed on the gospel and blues posters plastered across the streets. Names like B.B. King and Mahalia Jackson glowed behind glass, stages blazing like stars too far to touch. Still, David couldn't stop picturing his name up there someday. But when night fell, reality dragged him back to a cold, dark alley where music from nearby bars only made his dreams taste more bitter. On August 1st, 1954, a slim chance appeared. While working near a small church on Beale Street, David heard singing spill out from inside. The melody, raw and heartfelt, stirred something deep within him. Without thinking, he stepped in, despite his ragged appearance drawing stares from the congregation. When the service ended, David took his turn to sing. His clear, soulful voice rang out, filling the old wooden walls, silencing the room. Then a miracle happened. He was invited to join the choir. All they asked was that he stay clean and show up on time. For the first time since leaving Wynot, David felt he belonged somewhere, even if just for a moment. From then on, he sang every Sunday, earning a few dollars a week, barely enough for a loaf of bread and a shared bed in a rundown boarding house. But Beale Street's glitter hid lurking traps. Beneath the music's pulse lay a world of drugs, despair, and lives spiraling out of control. David often saw the hollow eyes of those too far gone, eyes that mirrored his own in his darkest moments. Though he tried to keep his distance, he knew he was walking a tightrope. If he wasn't strong enough, Memphis could swallow his soul and his dreams whole. In 1955, at 14, David faced a shock that cracked his fragile trust. On March 15th, during a gospel performance at a small club, he sang before the biggest crowd he'd ever seen. Pouring every buried emotion into "Precious Lord, Take My Hand," he sang of the pain of Wynot, his mother's death, and the hungry nights under Memphis bridges. The crowd's applause roared as he hit the final note, and a man claiming to manage a gospel group approached with a dazzling offer. David's eyes lit up, seeing a new world unfold. But reality struck hours later. In a smoky, dim bar, he saw the man's true colors. Not a music man, but a predator preying on homeless kids. When the man's hand gripped David's shoulder with sinister intent, David broke free and bolted into the street, heart pounding, breath ragged. That night, curled up in a dark alley, he realized Memphis, like Wynot, was never safe. Everywhere had traps, just dressed up differently. That betrayal left a deep scar. From then on, David distrusted every glance and offer, no matter how kind. But instead of breaking, he poured everything into music, the one thing that never betrayed him. Each time he sang in a poor church or a smoky bar, he wasn't just performing, he was freeing his pent-up pain. His voice grew deeper, rougher, but so raw it held listeners captive. One October evening, a bar owner wept hearing him sing. That was when David realized his voice wasn't just a gift, it was a testament to wounds that never healed. By 1956, David carved out a small place in Memphis's gospel scene. He joined a local group called the Gospel Stars, performing at rural churches and small fairs. The pay was meager, but enough to rent a shabby room and buy a few decent clothes, his first pair of shoes without holes. Yet early success bred envy from those around him. He was sidelined, gossiped about, called arrogant. Though it hurt, David didn't waver. On stage, he sang like he was tearing open old wounds, each note easing a pain that never slept. But each night, back in his tiny room, emptiness waited. Loneliness and fear of failure loomed like shadows. Past words, beatings, betrayals replayed in his mind like a song with no end. David started turning to liquor, not for fun, but to forget. The more he drank, the sharper the memories cut. He never felt enough, at least not in his own eyes. The years in Memphis were a ceaseless struggle. The Gospel Stars gave David a sliver of fame and a few bucks, but they were no family. Older members soon showed their jealousy, bristling at his shine and bold ideas. Tensions peaked in March 1956, when David convinced a fair's organizers to let the group add a solo spot for him. After the show, the rift exploded. The group's leader, Leroy, lashed out publicly. Amid backstage glares, David stood tall, refusing to bend. The crack was irreparable, and by May, he left, carrying wounded pride and an unshakable resolve. If no one believed in his path, he'd walk it alone, even if it meant bleeding. From there, David dove into Beale Street's wild music world, where gospel bled into soul and blues. He sang anywhere with a mic: churches, fairs, smoky bars, or rowdy nightclubs. Each performance was a fight to prove himself, not the abandoned kid from Wynot, but a real artist rising from the dark. In August 1957, under the dim lights of the Blue Moon Club, David silenced the room with "Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen." A promoter approached after, praising him and promising a future, words sweet as honey. But David's calm eyes hid a storm of doubt. The sting of that earlier betrayal still burned, and he'd learned not to trade his trust too easily. Memphis wasn't just a music hub, it tested resolve. Small stages and bars brimmed with booze, smokes, and tempting offers. One November night in 1957, after a long set, a sax player slipped David a special cigarette, a supposed escape from exhaustion and emptiness. He tried it once, but that brief high opened a dangerous door. The next morning, staring at the flaking ceiling of his rundown room, David swore he wouldn't do it again. But deep down, a seed of surrender had been planted. By 1959, David was a known name in Memphis's music circles. A small label signed him, releasing a few gospel tracks that didn't make waves. The money let him move into a shabby apartment with a creaky bed and peeling walls. But with a touch of fame came heavier pressure. Promoters wanted more, louder, flashier, to draw crowds. To cope, David started drinking before shows. One April night, liquor nearly toppled him as the music kicked off. The crowd still cheered, but the club owner's cold stare was a wordless warning. In the dressing room after, David saw a stranger in the mirror, a young man with sunken eyes, being eaten alive by his own ambitions. By early 1961, David knew Memphis couldn't take him further. He made a bold call: leave for Detroit, where soul music was surging and Motown was rewriting America's sound. With a few $100 tucked away and a worn suitcase, he boarded a bus, leaving behind years of smoke, music, and unhealed scars. As streetlights flashed past the window, Detroit felt like more than a destination. It was where he'd redefine himself. No longer a victim, no longer forgotten. On March 15, 1961, David stepped into Detroit, a city pulsing with soul and unformed dreams. He rented a cramped room in a working-class area where car horns and factory smoke blended into a constant hum. One April evening in a small church, he sang "Amazing Grace" with such raw honesty it felt like shedding every lingering ounce of loneliness. Among the sparse crowd, a young woman named Sandra locked eyes with him. A gentle seamstress from a simple family, she lived quietly, always hoping for a steady future. That meeting sparked a bond between two lost souls, one seeking refuge, the other yearning for unconditional love. Their love grew quietly, blossoming through chilly Detroit walks. On November 12, 1961, they married in a modest church ceremony with just a few relatives present. Sandra wore a white dress she'd tailored herself, and David, for the first time, felt wholly loved, no need to hide or prove anything. They settled into a small apartment where Sandra carefully tended every corner with handmade curtains, turning a makeshift place into a real home. But that joy barely took root before David's past began to threaten it. His music career pulled him into Detroit's smoky bars, where passion and temptation walked hand in hand. As Motown's light began to glow, David drifted from Sandra. One late December night, he stumbled home near dawn, reeking of whiskey. Sandra, cradling their baby girl Cheryl, silently watched the man she loved change. David knew he was running, from feeling unworthy, from memories that never rested. The harder he tried to be a provider, the deeper he sank into liquor and insecurity. Cracks in their marriage started to show. Sandra raised their child alone, while David was rarely home. He wrestled with stage pressure and inner demons, sometimes leaning on hard liquor or backstage joints. Seeing his daughter brought a pang to his heart, not from lack of love, but from fear he'd lose everything again. Detroit, with all its glamour and opportunity, was turning him into someone else, more dazzling but more fragile than ever. In early 1962, the chance he'd dreamed of arrived. Motown was hunting fresh voices to shape a generation's sound. David caught a producer's eye and was invited to audition for The Temptations, a young group with potential but no big break. In a small Hitsville, USA studio, he sang "I Want a Love I Can See," like he was shedding every weight on his shoulders. His voice, deep and fierce, left the room speechless. They all knew, right then, they'd found their missing piece. On February 15, 1962, David officially joined The Temptations, launching a blazing new chapter in his music journey. The early days with The Temptations were a whirlwind of fame. David, with his powerhouse voice and fiery stage presence, became the heart of every show. From Detroit nightclubs to Chicago auditoriums, he had audiences on their feet. The peak came at New York's Apollo Theater in June 1962, when David poured his soul into "My Girl." The crowd went wild, chanting his name like he was born for stardom. But when the stage lights dimmed, alone backstage, David gripped a glass of whiskey, hands still shaking from the emotional rush. He knew, no matter how big he got, the hole in his heart wasn't filled. And the old shadows still trailed his every step. As the stage lights blazed on his soaring career, David's family life sank into darkness. Sandra, now mother to 3, Cheryl, Nedra, and Kimberly, wore herself out in their cramped Detroit apartment. She juggled diapers, bills, and sleepless nights alone, while David was gone more and more. He was caught up in grueling tour schedules, lavish artist parties, and late-night benders. On the night of February 18, 1963, he stumbled home near dawn, reeking of whiskey and a strange perfume. Sandra, holding their youngest, looked helplessly at a man she no longer knew. To David, fame was his excuse, the reason for his absence, for the growing gulf between him and his family. But deep down, he knew he was fleeing from feeling unworthy, from the fear that one day his loved ones would turn their backs like his father had. Then, on May 10, 1963, everything shattered. In David's coat pocket, Sandra found a love letter scented with perfume, sent from a woman in Chicago. To her, it wasn't just paper, it was proof their love had rotted. Furious, she demanded he leave. David walked out, offering no explanation, and drowned his regret in a familiar bar. He told himself Sandra couldn't grasp the pressure he was under. But inside, he knew he'd lost the one person who saw the real him. Sandra, now both mother and father, borrowed money to raise their kids. Though David earned plenty from shows, most went to flashy suits and endless parties. Their once burning love was now cold ash. Their marriage ended on March 10, 1965. After too many letdowns, Sandra stood at the door, out of tears, resolute to move on for herself and the kids. David, drained and drunk, didn't fight it. He knew it was beyond saving. He tried staying close to his daughters, but the distance was too wide. Cheryl, who once clung to him, now looked at him with unfamiliar eyes, full of unasked questions. Unable to face the loss, David turned to drugs. On April 20, 1965, a friend introduced him to cocaine, saying it would melt his pain away. The first hit brought a breathless high, like all his fears vanished. But soon he couldn't hit the stage without it, not for fun, but to hide the terror that the spotlight might one day go dark, leaving him with nothing. On June 15, 1965, amid the buzz of Motown studio, David met Tammy Terrell, a rising star with a radiant smile and a voice clear as morning. Tammy, shining in duets with Marvin Gaye, was drawn to David's bold charm. Late nights in the studio became their haven, where music wove their longing hearts together. Their romance sparked fast, burning bright like nothing could snuff it out. But that fire didn't last. David's erratic moods, packed tour schedule, and growing cocaine habit turned him into someone else, quick-tempered, jealous, controlling. He couldn't hide his irritation when Tammy performed with Marvin, her close colleague. His jealousy boiled over at a Motown party, cracking their fragile bond. Rumors of his violent behavior grew. One night in Chicago, backstage erupted with the sounds of a heated argument between them. Tammy's friends grew worried. Even Marvin couldn't ignore seeing his duet partner wither under unseen pressures. Their romance ended on July 20, 1967, when Tammy walked away, exhausted by the hurt. But the tragedy didn't stop there. Months later, Tammy was diagnosed with a brain tumor silently ravaging her health. Though they'd parted, the news crushed David. Guilt gnawed at him, the thought that their turmoil might have broken her. Hearing Tammy's voice in old hits stabbed his heart, not just for lost love, but for regret he couldn't undo. He leaned harder on cocaine to escape, becoming a dim shadow of himself. While his heart broke, David still commanded the stage. Hits like Ain't Too Proud to Beg and I Wish It Would Rain launched the Temptations to new heights. But fame couldn't quench his hunger for control. David grew convinced he was the group's true soul. In a tense meeting, he brazenly suggested renaming the group to center himself, igniting long-simmering conflicts. The breaking point came on April 15, 1968. After a string of reckless acts, skipping rehearsals, showing up late, performing drunk, David was fired from the Temptations. He stormed out of Motown's office, eyes blazing with fury and betrayal. But by nightfall, only emptiness remained. The Temptations weren't just a band, they'd been his only family after his marriage collapsed. Now that was gone too. He was alone, with cocaine in his pocket and a career teetering on the edge. His oversized ego led to that crossroads. In his final days with the group, he distanced himself, renting private cars instead of riding with the band, wearing lavish suits, skipping key shows. A missed performance in Cleveland, where he partied instead, was the final straw. The group performed short-handed, costing them reputation and money. Soon, Dennis Edwards replaced him. Though David acted unfazed, deep down, he knew he'd lost something irreplaceable. On July 10, 1968, he launched his solo career with fierce hope. He poured his heart into recordings, aiming to recapture the magic of My Girl. His album, My Whole World Ended, released in May 1969, earned praise for its raw emotion. But Motown didn't fully back him. His personal chaos and self-destructive habits made the label wary, stinting on promotion. Later albums, like Feelin' Good, faded into obscurity. David sat in his dark Detroit apartment, staring at dusty records, feeling abandoned. In a fit of rage and helplessness, he smashed a whiskey bottle against the wall, convincing himself Motown was sabotaging him to lift others up. After the shock of being fired and his solo career's flop, David sank deeper into drugs. Cocaine, once an escape from loneliness and pain, became the master of his life. Night after night, he burned cash on lavish parties, surrounded by hangers-on who vanished when his generosity dried up. On December 12, 1968, police raided a rundown Detroit apartment where David hosted a chaotic party. Cocaine was found on the table and in his coat. His bloodshot eyes and trembling voice couldn't hide his state as he was cuffed amid flashing press cameras. Headlines screamed about the Motown star's fall into scandal. In a cold cell, gripping the bars, David tried to believe it wasn't the end. But the truth was a long, slippery slope. In desperation, David lashed out at the Temptations. On October 20, 1968, at New York's Apollo Theater, he stormed the stage, snatching the mic from Dennis Edwards to sing My Girl with all his pent-up passion and bitterness. The crowd roared, but the band's backlash, especially from Otis Williams, turned the stunt into a media storm of criticism. David kept disrupting shows, shouting his name from the crowd, trying to climb on stage, even rumored to have paid hecklers to boo Edwards. These acts didn't just tarnish his image, they cost him Motown's support, leaving his solo path lonelier. Personal tragedies piled on. On March 15, 1970, Tammy Terrell's death from her brain tumor hit David like a blade to the heart. Guilt and self-blame consumed him, driving him to a deadlier drug. On March 20, 1970, he tried heroin, feeling a fleeting comfort that soon chained him. Heroin became his crutch, propping him up for dwindling gigs before thinning crowds. His solo career plummeted. David sang in dim bars where smoke and nostalgia hung heavy. Each performance held his heart, but his eyes lacked life, like he was chasing something long gone. On July 10, 1971, in Cleveland, he forgot lyrics and was booed off stage. The bar owner, with contempt, threw his pay at him, signaling the end of his glory days. David, clutching the meager cash, stepped into the cold, feeling the world mock him. He turned to heroin for relief, but waking up filthy and broken on the sidewalk only deepened his shame. His bond with his daughters grew distant. Cheryl, Nedra, and Kimberly lived with Sandra elsewhere, rarely seeing their father. On September 5, 1971, David promised to take Cheryl out, but ditched her for a promoter's party. Cheryl, in a dress her mom made, waited on the corner, tears falling as she walked home. Sandra, now with her mother, only let David see the kids if he was sober and paid support. But lost in drugs and debt, he couldn't. Seeing their photos in his wallet tore at his heart, yet instead of healing, he buried his feelings in heroin. A flicker of hope came when David teamed up with Eddie Kendricks for a southern tour in early 1972. Early shows revived old magic, their voices blending like old times. But David's arrogance killed the dream. At an Atlanta show on March 20th, 1972. A fight over the closing number led him to storm off, leaving Eddie alone before a disappointed crowd. The fallout made headlines, ending their Temptations duo. Promoters blacklisted David from major tours, and alone in a hotel, smoking, he saw he'd wrecked his last chance. By 1973, David hit rock bottom. On May 10th, he sued Motown, claiming they'd cheated him out of royalties. The draining legal battle ate his savings and ended in defeat. Desperate, he ditched cocaine for heroin, seeking fleeting escape, but becoming a ghost of himself. On a frigid night, December 15, 1973, in a rage, he trashed a small label studio, killing an album project. His once blazing career was now ashes, and his legendary voice was burying itself. On June 15, 1975, at a grimy Cleveland bar, David performed for a sparse crowd. The voice that once shook America trembled from heroin and liquor. The audience, mostly drunks and a few old fans, watched with pity. Finishing "My Whole World Ended," the bar owner scornfully tossed his pay at him, a cruel jab. David, gaunt and hollow, gripped the cash and stepped into the cold. He sought a heroin hit to dull the failure, but woke up sprawled on the sidewalk, clothes filthy like a vagrant. Detroit, which once cheered him, was now a prison where he wandered among his past's shards. David's 1970s were an endless spiral. Heroin, once a brief escape, owned every breath. 2 rehab stints, March 1974 and September 1975, failed as he relapsed, blind to any way out. His health crumbled, his once handsome face gaunt, his golden voice faltering, performances strained. Old Motown friends like Marvin Gaye and Smokey Robinson distanced themselves, unable to watch his self-destruction. His daughters, Cheryl, Nedra, and Kimberly, cut contact, unforgiving of his abandonment. Seeing their photos stabbed his heart, but he drowned the pain in more heroin. A faint light broke through on February 20th, 1976, when David married Joy Hamilton, a strong fashion industry woman drawn to his tragic tale. She believed love could save him. Their modest Detroit church wedding carried his promise to change, spoken in an old suit. But those vows vanished like smoke. Their Parkside Street home, once a haven with Sandra, became a battleground. Joy's patience turned to despair, finding thousands spent on drugs. On May 10, 1977, she found cocaine stashed with his kids' old photos. Her anger and heartbreak erupted, demanding he stop ruining everything. David, high, smirked and said she'd never get him. The breaking point came July 15, 1977, after a failed show when a drunk David hit Joy, knocking her down. Police were called, though Joy later dropped charges, clinging to faint hope. The news spread fast, tabloids screaming, "David Ruffin attacks wife. Motown star hits bottom." Devastated, Joy filed for divorce on December 20, 1977, calling him a hopeless addict. In court, David bowed his head, feeling his world collapse. After the split, the Parkside Street house stood empty, as cold as his life. Finances crashed. Earnings from My Girl and Ain't Too Proud to Beg vanished into drugs, designer clothes, and Motown lawsuits. Bank debts piled up, plus over $310,000 in taxes from 1975 to 77. On June 10, 1982, arrested in Indiana for tax evasion and jailed briefly, the bank seized his home. His belongings, Apollo stage suits, Temptations vinyls, photos with his kids, were dumped on the curb. Neighbors, once admirers, watched silently, many shaking their heads. A local paper captured the scene, headlining, "From Motown Heights to the Street, David Ruffin's Tragedy." Back in Detroit on October 15, 1982, he stood before the fenced-off house, peering at the window where Cheryl once played piano, then turned, fading into the dark. David drifted, crashing with friends or renting decrepit apartments in Detroit and Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, instability ruled. Unable to pay rent, he leaned on Eddie Kendricks or old colleagues. On a freezing night, December 10, 1990, evicted for unpaid rent, he slept in a friend's car with just a suitcase of worn clothes, a photo of his kids, and $53. A spark flared November 20, 1982, when David began seeing Jenna Sapia, a Detroit bookstore clerk captivated by his haunted charm. They shared a small apartment where Jenna tried pulling him from addiction's grip. But chained to cocaine and heroin, David grew volatile. One night, high, he turned violent when Jenna hid his drugs. Terrified, she called police. Though she later withdrew the complaint after his apology, the scandal leaked, tabloids blaring. Heartbroken, Jenna left in March 1983, leaving David alone, weighed by guilt. By 1987, in his 40s, David lived precariously in Philadelphia with Diane Showers, a former fan. They rented rundown apartments, David singing in small bars to fund drugs. Diane, devoted, covered rent with side jobs as his earnings fed his habit. In August 1987, after a cocaine-fueled fight, David pushed Diane, prompting a police call. Cops found cocaine, arresting him for possession and assault. Diane dropped charges after his plea, but the scandal cemented his fall. Fans who once adored his voice now saw only a violent addict. Motown excluded him from anniversary events, and peers like Otis Williams spoke of him with pity. Tragedy kept mounting. On May 15, 1989, David performed "I Wish It Would Rain" at a West Philadelphia nightclub to a quiet crowd. His faded voice still carried Wynot, Memphis, and Detroit's pain. But afterward, he vanished into a crack house, chasing cocaine to flee reality. Diane, powerless, accepted she couldn't save him. Rumors of a belt holding $30,000 from a UK tour swirled, but if it existed, it vanished, likely to friends or dealers. Diane suspected but got no answers. David stayed silent, as if money meant nothing. He scraped by, carrying a battered suitcase with clothes and a "My Whole World Ended" vinyl, a bitter reminder of his turbulent life. On May 31, 1991, David took the stage at Philadelphia's Club Zanzibar with Eddie Kendricks and Temptations alumni. Though frail, his voice roared through "Ain't Too Proud to Beg," tearing the club's heavy air. The crowd went wild, many still calling him Soul's King. A rare smile crossed David's face, his eyes flickering with old glory. But it faded as he left the stage, snorting cocaine to stay alert. Instead of going home to Diane, he followed William Nowell and Donald Brown to a rundown West Philadelphia house, a notorious crack house with boarded windows, dim lights, and the stench of drug smoke. This wasn't David's home, just a den for addicts, thick with despair. Broken bottles littered the floor, and hushed voices of lost souls formed a world apart. High, David shared 10 vials of crack with Nowell and Brown in half an hour. Laughter burst as he recalled Apollo days, but then his body shook, clutching his chest in pain. A strange cold breeze swept the room, though windows were shut, making the table's candle flicker. Nowell later said David, before collapsing, whispered hearing a gospel choir from his Mississippi youth calling him. David passed out, sparking panic. They stuffed him into a limousine and raced to the University of Pennsylvania hospital. In the sleek black limo, David lay still in the back, face pale, breathing faint. At the ER in the early hours of June 1, 1991, Nowell dragged him to a wheelchair, begged nurses to save him, and vanished. Doctors, unaware of his identity, logged him as John Doe and fought to revive him. But David's heart stopped after the monitor's weak beeps. An autopsy confirmed death by cocaine overdose, his body ravaged by liver failure and hypertension. At 50, his tragic end closed a Motown legend's story. David's death rocked Philadelphia and Motown's community. When Eddie Kendricks confirmed his identity hours later, the hospital swarmed with media. Rumors flew. Forced overdose. Robbery murder. Police searched the crack house, but it was abandoned, witnesses uncooperative. The case was ruled an accidental overdose, yet questions about the limo lingered, deepening the tragedy's pain. His funeral, held June 10, 1991, at Detroit's New Bethel Baptist Church, drew hundreds, from 1960s fans to Motown stars like Otis Williams. Diane Showers, too grieved to attend, sent a wreath inscribed, "David, you'll always be my light." His death was a stark warning about drugs in the artist world. His rootless Philadelphia life, without a stable home, mirrored his final years' loneliness. The overdose, with oddities around the limo and missing money, remains unanswered. Yet David's legacy endures. Songs like My Girl and Ain't Too Proud to Beg still play on airwaves, covered by new artists and inspiring legends like Stevie Wonder. On June 15, 2019, Detroit's Parkside Road was co-named David Ruffin Avenue in a ceremony with his family and Martha Reeves. The house at 1738-5, now someone else's, stands by an old oak where David once dreamed of glory. Locals say on quiet nights his soulful voice seems to echo as if his spirit never left. David Ruffin, whose voice moved the world, lived a life of stark contrasts, light and shadow. From his father's beatings, Wynot's racism, Memphis's poverty, to Detroit's stage glory, it all shaped a man both brilliant and broken. He craved recognition, but fear of rejection made him a victim of drugs, alcohol, and bad choices. Failed marriages, strained ties with his kids, and endless scandals turned a soul icon into a wandering ghost. When David left this world, we lost a genius, but his story endures as a costly reminder of fame's price and wounds that never heal.